Welcome to the second program in the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition's series, Hear Thy Neighbor. One of the goals of the coalition is to increase understanding and interaction between the Black and Jewish communities of Middlesex County. The Hear Thy Neighbor program allows community members to share their personal stories so that we may all come to know each other more closely. The theme of this episode is the insurrection that occurred in our nation's capital on January 6, 2021. We'll hear from two residents who are immigrants and two who are religious leaders. We'll be back throughout the program to give you some more information about the coalition and how you can get involved. In the meantime, thank you for joining us.
Greetings, my name is Sonia Headlam. I'm a member of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition, and it is my great pleasure tonight to sit and interview Rabbi Esther Reed, Senior Associate Director at Rutgers Hillel, a Jewish student organization, and also a member of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition. Rabbi Reed, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. As you know, the MBJC is dedicating an episode of Hear Thy Neighbor to the Capitol riots that took place on January 6th by speaking to Black and Jewish residents of Middlesex County about their perspectives and reactions to the event. But before we get into that, maybe you can tell me a little bit about your background. Where were you born and raised, and maybe a little bit about your family?
Sure. So I was born in Santa Monica, California, which sounds very exotic for people living in New Jersey. And I lived in the suburbs of Los Angeles until I was 10. And then my family moved to East Brunswick, New Jersey. So I like to say that I was raised in New Jersey, but I did spend parts of my childhood in Los Angeles, as well as Athens, Ohio, and the suburbs of Detroit. My parents were divorced, so there was a bit of travel that I did as a kid.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of your perspective and concepts of America, just growing up, and maybe, you know, some that you could have formed on your own or that you garnered from your family or other ways.
Sure. So my parents were both born and raised in the United States. My mother was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and my father was born in Brooklyn. My father's parents had come to the United States before World War II, and they were the only members of their family to leave Warsaw, Poland before the war began. So my grandparents, you know, a young couple coming to the United States alone, are the only members of that family left. Their entire extended family, their parents, their grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone died in the Holocaust. And on that side of the family, it is just my grandparents and their descendants. And I found out fairly recently that there is one distant cousin also in America that I had never met. And to this day, I've still not met. But otherwise, there's just not very much family there. And in that sense, I would say that America is a place of refuge and a place of safety for my family. My mother's family, it was a generation earlier that came to the United States. It was my great-grandparents that emigrated from Eastern Europe, also before World War II, but because it was so much earlier, I have many more relatives here in this country. And you know, I think that my experience has been that my family recognizes the benefits of being able to be in the United States and to have safety and not have to fear for our lives. But there have been moments of anti-Semitism and discrimination along the way that I have some stories I can share with you. But also, my family, you know, considers ourselves full citizens, patriotic. So my great uncle was a soldier during World War II in the American military, and he was one of the first soldiers in Germany into Berlin and wrote a book about it.
Wow.
So there's quite some interesting history about his involvement in the military during that time. The only other piece I want to mention is that my parents are divorced. My mother remarried when I was 12. My stepfather was born in Poland, survived the war, World War II, and came to the United States from a displaced persons camp after the war was over. And so he's been part of my life and my family's life for a long time. And certainly the United States has been a tremendous refuge for him. And later his sister was able to come as well to the United States, and they were able to, marry, have children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, and to be able to feel safe in this country. My stepfather in a few months, God willing, will be turning 97.
So you mentioned having a story to share, or maybe several stories to share about anti-Semitism and discrimination in regards to your family or experiences that you personally had. I'd love for you to share with our audience more about that.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people don't know about the anti-Semitic discrimination in America, especially throughout the early and middle of the 20th century. People don't know that there were quotas for Jews to get into college, that at a certain point, the universities were not permitting more Jews to be accepted because they had reached their limit. Same thing with graduate schools and medical schools. Jewish doctors, once they got a medical degree, couldn't get jobs in regular hospitals. And that's why there's the system in the United States of Jewish hospitals. Certain hospitals have the name Jewish in the name of the hospital. It's because that was a place where Jewish doctors could get jobs, and otherwise they couldn't. I personally experienced anti-Semitism most pointedly in 9th grade when I started a new school. And there were these two boys who would throw pennies at me. And just to explain, there's this stereotype that Jews are greedy. So the idea is that if they would throw pennies at me, I would be so interested in money that I would run to collect every penny. And so they would throw pennies at me. And they also would sing a Jewish song, Hava Nagila, tauntingly at me. But the story that I really enjoy sharing, because it sort of has a happy ending, is a story about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who rented an apartment in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1940s. The super for this apartment building, it was 215 units, was Mrs. Gershevsky. And Mrs. Gershevsky was arranging the details of leasing the apartment to my grandmother. And after my grandmother signed the lease, Mrs. Gershevsky said, "You're really going to like it here. There are only 3 Jewish families." And my grandmother took the keys and said, "Now there are 4. And it's a great story because it's like a legendary story in our family, not only to show the anti-Semitism of the time, but also to show how tough my grandmother was.
Yes.
And to be able to admit it and say in that moment, well, there are 4 Jewish families,
right.
And not to hide or to say, okay, thanks for letting me know, and run off. So I come from a family of formidable women.
Right. That's great that you have that kind of family story to pass on and hold on to that strength. Let's move on to talking about the events that occurred on January 6th. And maybe you could describe for me how and where you were taking in that news, and any gut reactions you might have had seeing or learning about what happened.
So I have to tell you that I woke up that morning very focused on the election results for the Senate race in Georgia. And I was really interested to know what the outcome was, because it would impact not only Georgia, but the entire Senate if both seats went to the Democratic senators. And I knew that Raphael Warnock had been called as the winner the night before, but it wasn't clear about Jon Ossoff. So I was really, really focused on what's the result? And I was delighted to hear that Ossoff won, not only as the first Jewish senator from the state of Georgia, but it was reported that he was only the second Jewish senator from the South. And that was a big victory. And I expected that to be all the news for the next few days, that both of these two Senate races were called for the Democrats and this big impact on our country. And I then heard about this attack on the Capitol, and it was shocking and also completely eclipsed the story that had been so important to me as a Jew and as a Democrat. So I was really surprised that there had been an attack, and I didn't fully understand the significance that day. I heard there was some sort of a rally. I heard that people came into the Capitol building, but I didn't quite fully grasp how violent it was until the next day, when I saw video and I saw photo images, seeing how these attackers literally broke into the building, defied the police. They wore symbols of hate. They seemed intent on causing damage. It wasn't a peaceful demonstration. I've been involved in many peaceful demonstrations, but these people showed up with weapons. They had tactical gear. They had plastic ties to, like, handcuffs to put around people, like they wanted to take prisoners or something like that. It was really surprising to me what was going on. This wasn't just people standing with signs quietly chanting or whatever it might be, but actually violent. And it reminded me of the Nazi rally that happened in Charlottesville in August 2017. Much of the hate was predicated on this idea of the country being stolen from white people. And the chant, they said in Charlottesville, "Jews will not replace us," is a direct call out to this vile theory called the Great Replacement Theory, which argues that the white race is being replaced by people of color, and that the Jews are the puppet masters, that Jews have this great plan and have some control behind the scenes and are going to allow and put forth people of color to take over. And it was some of the same white supremacists who had been in Charlottesville who showed up at the Capitol. And it was really surprising. I also saw the next day, as more and more news coverage came out about the attack at the Capitol, video and images that were blatantly anti-Semitic. There was this one man who was wearing a sweatshirt that said, "Work brings freedom," and it said Camp Auschwitz on it. Now, Auschwitz was a camp in Poland where Jews were interred and murdered during World War II, during the Holocaust. And when I was 18, I went to visit Auschwitz and Birkenau. And the entrance to Birkenau has this gate that says across the top, "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free, or work brings you freedom, which is what his sweatshirt said. So prisoners would get off the train and have this idea when they arrived at this camp, oh, if I work hard, I'll be able to get free. But it wasn't true. It was a way to control the prisoners so that they wouldn't be angry or upset or be emotional or revolt in some way. And in fact, if you look at the image of what the German says, the text in German at that gate, the actual gate, Arbeit macht frei, the B is flipped upside down. So the Jewish workers who were instructed by the Germans to create this gate were able to somehow flip the B upside down. It's very subtle, but they were trying to give a signal to the Jews entering this camp for the first time. Don't believe what you read. Things are not as they appear. It's actually not going to bring you freedom. 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the idea that someone would wear a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt to mock the horrible crimes against humanity, the genocide that took place there, and would also, wear that specific sweatshirt. I'm sure he knew what he was doing at that particular rally, surrounded by other white supremacists. It was very disturbing to me that this was something happening in our capital, and that our president had encouraged those people to go to the Capitol when he spoke with them from a podium when they had this rally before they marched down to the Capitol. It was really upsetting and disturbing to me. There were video footage of pro-Trump extremists sitting on the steps of the Capitol building with a young man smiling and giving what appears to be a Nazi salute. There were flyers from the New Jersey European Heritage Association, a white supremacist group. These flyers were posted near the Capitol that read, "Small hats, big problem," and it's next to an image of a yarmulke. Unfortunately, the New Jersey European Heritage Association is a group that has been very active under the Trump presidency in the last 4 years. They have put posters up in multiple places at the Rutgers University campus. They've gone to Staten Island. They've gone to other places. They've been in the news for their activism in trying to recruit white people to join their group supporting European heritage, which, is a white supremacist group to the exclusion of people in the United States of other heritage that's not white European. And so there were so many disturbing things that I saw that made me feel like what had been in the extreme had now become more out in the open. Mm-hmm. And it's frightening when you see something that is a fringe ideology, but is getting more coverage and more attention and is in the center of our country. I heard a news report that said this was the first time in all of American history that Confederate flag was inside the Capitol building. Even during the Civil War, there had never been a Confederate flag inside the Capitol building. And to me, the Confederate flag is not only associated with the enslavement of Black people. We know that all of the white supremacist groups in the United States that are anti-Black, they are also, every single one of them, are anti-Semitic. And so to me, the Confederate flag is not only seen as an anti-Black symbol, but it's against Jews as well. Because white supremacists do not consider Jews to be part of the white race. They consider us to be a different race, whatever that means. There were multiple references to ZOG, Z-O-G, which stands for the Zionist Occupied Government, this idea that Jews control the government. And that goes back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a fictitious document that was written at the end of the 19th century and has been translated into dozens of languages, can still be found throughout the Arab world, unfortunately, and is a document that purports to show that Jews have this secret cabal that's planning to run the world and is influential and behind the scenes in charge of all decision making, which is simply not true, of course, but it feeds into anti-Semitism. And I also saw a picture of the man carrying the podium, the speaker's podium from the Capitol, and saying that Zog has been overthrown next to a picture of the Arch of Titus in Rome from when Titus, the Roman general, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 and took multiple implements from the temple that were important to the Jewish people, including the menorah, which can be seen very clearly on the Arch of Titus, from the Arch of Titus. So there were so many anti-Semitic references that day and symbols of hate that it was really disturbing and upsetting to see.
So maybe you can tell us a little about what your thoughts are about where we go from here as a country.
Absolutely. I think I want to start again looking at history. I think a lot of people don't know that Georgia was the state where a Jew was lynched in the early 20th century. His name was Leo Frank, and he was accused of having raped and murdered a young woman, Mary Fagan. In reality, years later, of course, it was determined it was someone else. But at the time, Leo Frank was not only brought to trial, but while he was in prison, and I don't mean a little county jail, but in prison, a mob came and abducted him from the prison, including, I believe, a judge and some people who were pretty well known in that community. And they abducted him and lynched him, hung him from a tree, in the way that African Americans had been lynched in Georgia around the same time. And so for me, the symbolism of a Jew becoming the senator, also from Georgia, is really extraordinary. And the fact that when John Ossoff took the oath to become a senator, he used a Bible that had been from the rabbi at a Reform temple in Atlanta, Georgia, that had been bombed by white supremacists in 1958 because the rabbi of that congregation had spoken out against mistreatment of Blacks. So I do feel like there is sort of circles of moving in a positive direction when you see where we came from in our history and where we're going now. And that's important to me. I think the work that Sonia, you and I do with the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition is very important, that we really need to stand up for one another. We really need to be able to speak out when necessary, when there's discrimination against the other. FBI statistics show that when Jews are targeted, other minorities are soon targeted afterwards. And so the level of anti-Semitism that a society tolerates indicates the amount of discrimination or hate it's likely to cast upon other minorities. Hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. So the fact that we can join together in the Middlesex County Black-Jewish Coalition, I think is so important, and that we can support each other, stand up for one another, and really be involved in changing our community and eventually, hopefully, this country to be the kind of place where we want to continue to live and to raise our children and to be part of society.
Yes, in a way, we do continue to see these cycles, and the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition, I think we've done a lot of work in our short amount of time, and we want to continue doing that. So it's also a time to share with everyone to please join us if they're interested in getting involved. It has been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I don't think so, but this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One of the other missions of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition is to advocate for causes and actions that can benefit our communities.
One example is our support for several New Jersey state bills that address transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Senate Bill 2656 and Assembly Bill 5301 propose making law enforcement disciplinary records subject to the Open Public Records Act.
To advocate for these bills, we've met and continue to meet with state and local representatives.
Written op-eds in local and statewide newspapers,
and encouraged a letter-writing campaign to state representatives.
These bills are a step in the direction towards transparency and accountability in law enforcement. This is one example of the type of advocacy the coalition has become involved in. If you're interested in more information about these specific bills or would like to get involved, please contact us.
Hi, I'm Gary Leslie. I'm a member of the Middlesex County Black-Jewish Coalition, and I'm very pleased tonight to welcome back Highland Park Councilperson Elsie Foster. Councilperson Foster, thank you very much for being here.
It's my honor and privilege to be with you guys once again. This is awesome.
So you spoke to us in our previous event, but we wanted to talk to you again to get your impressions of the events that took place in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. We're particularly interested in your take on what happened because you yourself are an immigrant and you're originally from Jamaica, is that correct?
That is correct.
And where in Jamaica?
Kingston, Jamaica.
Okay. What was it like growing up there?
Jamaica is a very, very beautiful island. People are warm and loving. Well, growing up, it's funny because my aunt used to say children only go to two places, church and school. Very religious country at the time. And so basically that's what we did, church, school, and occasionally Sunday afternoon outings. And which was good. We used to go Sunday afternoons. It's this place called Port Royal. It's a sunken city under the sea from the days of the pirates, you know, from Captain Morgan's time. And the real pirates of the Caribbean, Jamaica was their hangout spot. And so that whole island, part of the island had sunk. And we used to go there and see the ruins. We take a boat over and see the ruins under the water. And it was really interesting because you never get tired of seeing it.
Sounds like a beautiful childhood. Now, what was the political situation like there?
It was a very beautiful childhood growing up until the 70s. In the 70s, there was a huge political shift. With that political shift came crime, violence, unspeakable crime, unspeakable violence that we saw. We saw from growing up in a nice residential neighborhood that it seemed like to me in my child's eye that neighborhood did a 360 overnight switch where we were one day walking peaceably to school or taking the bus or taking a taxi to school or being driven to school to the next thing that we know is that curfew was put in place. People had to guard. We had what we call neighborhood watch here. It was a similar thing. They didn't call it that though. But the neighborhood was being guarded. People had to take shifts to make sure that only people that lived on our block was on our block after certain times of night. Because what had happened is that a gang of people had come in and right directly across the street from my house, there was another house with teenage girls. And those girls were abducted, taken, and they were raped and tortured. And it was just horrible.
And you knew these young...
We grew up, we were friends, we played together. We, as you know, as children, you grow up in your neighborhood, just like it is here. The kids know each other, they play and they hung out. And then it seemed like overnight, all of this horrific violence that you couldn't even speak about was happening. You can't sleep at night, you toss and turn, you dream that it was your turn. And it was just one nightmare after the other. It had gotten so bad that we had seen where people were taken from their homes, beaten, stabbed, chopped up, murder.
And you witnessed some of this as a child?
Fortunately, I did. And you know, they had a thing called the necklace where they would catch someone and from, I guess, whatever opposing party that they assumed the person was from. And they would take a tire and they would set it on fire and put the person around the person's body. Now, it was pretty horrific.
Who were these people? I mean, what?
That's what I have always wondered, like, who were these people? What kind of hearts did they have? How could you do something like this? Like, where did these people come from? Did they have parents? Did they have sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers? But that's what happened. Similar, disturbingly enough, when I saw what happened in our nation's capital, it brought me all the way back there. When I saw the noose, the ties, the makeshift gallows, the people chanting, looking for Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence to hang them, it all came flooding back.
So let me just back you up a second, because this is what you experienced in Jamaica growing up. How did you feel when you came to this country?
Well, when we first came, everything was beautiful. We loved America, of course, and it's in the immigrant story. You come here, you love your new homeland. You had to get used to the culture, the people. You had a lot of learning curves. And as you got over those learning curves, then it became more normalized, and you get to settle in and everything else like that. One of the things that was a stark difference was during the time for President Carter election. I remember me saying to my sister that it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same, because this is what happened with politics. And she kept on saying, I confided in her, say, and that this is going to be the same thing that we experienced before. And there was no way you could have convinced me other. And my parents kept on saying, it's not like that. It's never going to be like that. This is America. That kind of stuff doesn't happen in the United States. It just doesn't happen. And they were so confident of what their belief was and what their experiences were. I wasn't that confident. I didn't feel confident. I didn't trust the system that it was going to go the way they said. Well, the night of the election came, there was campaigns and what have you. The night of the election came after dinner. My sister and I went up into the attic, and we hid in the attic because we were confident that we were going to see the same level of violence and crime. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, I woke up. I peeped out the window, and it was quiet. It was calm. There was nobody on the street. I slowly made my way downstairs to the second floor, and my parents were busy about their day. My sisters and brothers were in their room sleeping. And eventually I went downstairs. My mom was making breakfast. The TV was on, and they announced that, we have a new president. President Carter was our president. And I sheepishly went to the window and I peeped out. There was nothing going on. People were driving their cars down the street, but nothing was going on. And I went back to the TV, and I was just watching. I remember it was Channel 7. I was watching Channel 7 news because I was just waiting to see where the crime and violence happened. And there was none. And I was like, nothing happened? They had an election and nothing. I said, are you sure we have a new president? They say, yes, nothing happened. And that was the day I fell in love with this United States of America, because I saw democracy at its best. I saw people going out from opposing parties, voted for whom they wanted, without anyone being chopped up, killed, murdered, named, and no one being abducted. And I had great faith. That was the day that, my faith in the political system, I would say that was when that was born, and great admiration and love and respect for this country.
Okay. And then January 6th happened.
And then January 6th, and it all came flooding back. It came flooding back in torrents, because it was just a relive of what I had experienced as a child. And I could not believe it, because the zip ties, the noose, the chanting people in their costumes and whatever, and they're yelling for their pound of flesh. They're yelling for Nancy Pelosi. They're yelling for Mike Pence. And they had built a gallows, and they were out there, and they were storming the Capitol, and they were throwing bottles and grenades, and they were breaking windows, and they were going in, and they were going after people. It was the same experience all over again, something that I thought I would never, ever live to see in these United States. And it just shattered everything. It really did. I was beyond upset.
If you could speak to some of those people that did that, is there something you would say to them?
There could be a lot of things that you could say. But let's not forget that America was built on the backs of Black people, enslaved people, people that were not even considered to be humans. And I'm one of those people that were not even considered to be human. My ancestors went through it all. And if you have those people that after generation and generation, and they still believe and behave that way, there's nothing that you can say, because they take a steady diet of all that stuff. And if 400 years has passed and they still believe that, there's not much you can do to redeem any of those people. They say that they were mixed groups of people. Yes, there's some people that you can have a conversation with and you can say, you know, what's really going on? What are some of your fears, or what are some of your anxieties? Some people you can have that conversation with, but not much. I remember in the early 2000s here in Highland Park, when we had our racial disputes and uprising, and the town was on edge. The town was truly on edge, and we wanted answers, and we had to find answers. We had to find a way to work together to bring about somewhat of a truth and reconciliation process. And I remember we had bridge builders. We had different kinds of groups. We had study circles that we put together, and we worked really, really hard of trying to understand each other. We tried to bring communities together. We shared meals. We had discussions, and people had an opportunity to see it from in her shoe or in his shoe. You know, so that brought about something. But I am not hopeful that the masses that I saw on January 6th is that kind of people that is willing to listen and come to the table and listen, and to have true and honest discussion, and to break bread and to try to live peaceably together. Some people will, but for the most part, I don't have that kind of faith. I'm sorry, I just don't.
We're recording this several weeks after the inauguration of a new president and vice president. Mm-hmm. There is a certain amount of falling out of support for the previous administration.
Yes.
Do you see, how do you see the country moving forward from this? And do you have any view of the future about how we can move forward?
Biden has Camilla and Biden have a lot of work to do. We are broken. We are broken as a country, and we need fixing. I believe that President Biden has done a tremendous job in trying to bring healing and trying to pull us. He didn't say we're one America. He said we are one United States. We are united. That's the word, united. And if we're one United States, we're not saying you're this part of the Americas and I'm this part of the America. We're all one, and we need to come together. And as families, we have disagreements. Let's come together. Let's work on these disagreements. Just like in all our families, we have disagreements, and we try to find a way to work through the disagreements. We try to find a way to work through the problem. We try to find a way to build better. And I think that the job that they both have, not just them both, I keep saying them both, but we all have, reasonable people have, is to find a way to build bridges and to build better. I think that we all collectively have a responsibility to make this world a little bit better than the way it was, the way we found it, or the way it was even before January 6th, because it's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring people to the table, to have honest conversations, and for people to start seeing man's humanity, man in humanity to man. That has to stop. And we have to start looking at people as they are, like our brothers and sisters. I know that's an easy word to say, brothers and sisters, but we really have to start looking and respecting people's opinions and values, and have true compassion for each other. I think that's the most important takeaway that we can do, because we can't look for the president and vice president to fix it by themselves. We have to be a part of that.
And I think that if people hear about what you've gone through as a child, and what people like you have gone through, in places where this sort of thing is more common, they might get a better perspective. Well,
and it's so sad. I just want to add to that. It's so sad that, I have last October, there was an election in Jamaica, and people from opposing parties were both riding on the same bikes going to vote. So 40 years later, people from opposing parties wearing the color, the one party wear orange, the other one wear green. And you could see people on the one bike, orange and green t-shirt, going to vote. And so there is hope. If we as a country in Jamaica have gone through such travails and have hit the lowest of the lowest, there is hope for the United States, because when I saw that brought back a lot of faith, because they were able to pull it together, and we can take a page from that book and to apply it here.
Well, that's a good note, I think, to end on. Thank you very much again, Councilperson Elsie Foster. I really appreciate your sharing your story, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition, I'd like to welcome Pastor Antoinette Moss and Pastor Kermit Moss, who have graciously agreed to speak with me today. Thank you so much for being here. As you know, the MBJC is dedicating this episode of Hear Thy Neighbor to reflections on the Capitol riots that took place on January 6th, 2021. We're speaking to Black and Jewish residents of Middlesex County about their perspectives and reactions to this really astonishing, horrifying event. Before we get into that, I'm wondering, though, if you could start by telling me a little bit about yourselves, your background, since that might help us understand your perspectives.
Sure. So I'm Pastor Kermit Moss. I'm the interim director for the Center for Black Church Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm also completing my PhD at Princeton in practical theology with an emphasis in education and formation. So I studied the intersections of hip hop and religion and actually protests. So this is really interesting. And I pastor in Paterson, New Jersey. So I wear lots of hats. And I am fortunate to be married to Pastor Antoinette.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, thank you so much for having us. I'm Pastor Antoinette Moss. I reside in Highland Park. We have 3 children. I am also the founding director of the Black Community Watch Line, which is based in Middlesex County. And again, I'm just happy to be here and share my perspective.
Thank you very much. How do you think your backgrounds may have impacted your perspective of America?
So our backgrounds are really interesting. So my background might be a typical background, and Pastor Antoinette's is typical in some sense, but I call her the nomad, right? And so my background is I was born in Richmond, Virginia. I was raised in Richmond, the Richmond, Virginia area, but I was made intellectual in terms of my intellectual formation in New York City. And so in terms of seeing race in various regions of the country, and how race operates in terms of our interaction, but also in the formation of policy, I was able to see it differently in those 2 distinct areas. So whereas in Virginia, it is rooted in, I would say, sort of a Southern racism with Southern heritage, kind of an honor and shame system that has deep roots historically in terms of the friction between Black and white, kind of within the binary. Whereas in the Northeast, it's similar in some ways, but is related to segregation of neighborhoods, segregation in terms of lack of interaction within groups, particularly racial and ethnic groups based upon residence. And so therefore, because of those lack of interaction, some type of stereotypes and some type of perceptions of the other come forth. And so there was difference, right? But in terms of governance, there are similarities in terms of policing, in terms of the ways that policy is constructed to benefit some as opposed to others. Those are very consistent on both regions in the country. So my perspective on what happened in terms of at the Capitol is very much rooted in those that kind of growing up and what I've seen.
And as he said, mine was very, very different. I have immigrant parents. My mom is from the Philippines. My father is from Haiti, and they met in a bowling alley in Germany. And that's where my formative years were, in Germany. And I didn't come here into the United States until middle school. It was actually that first sense of Black and white, right? Going into the cafeteria and wondering where I was going to sit, because I felt that segregation. And it was in the same place in Virginia, where we moved from Germany. And I felt that segregation in the cafeteria, that sense of where are you going to sit, right? Which group are you going to be with? And going through that period, and then of course later on living in New York City and New Jersey, and understanding how race continues to play a huge part in people's understanding and development and growth.
In some ways, it seems like in the Northeast, because it doesn't have that history in the South, maybe it's a little bit more insidious, right? This sort of divide between Black and white. It's there, but we maybe sort of deny that it exists, right?
Right. And, I'm glad actually you mentioned denial, because I was pondering a lot about this whole idea of American exceptionalism, right? This idea that somehow we are better, intrinsically better than others. And it also made me reflect on a preacher, John Winthrop, back in the early 1600s. And he talked about this notion of a city on a hill, and how somehow we are a beloved community, and somehow we can show others the right way to be. But unfortunately, everybody's not allowed on that hill, and people dictate what's considered exceptional, right? And so that really made me think about that, particularly looking at the insurgency and really the coup, right? The attempted coup that happened in the Capitol.
Right, and in terms, I'll piggyback off that. And in addition, it's also a sense of, it demystifies this notion of a regional exceptionalism as well. Because, and when it comes to the purviews or perceptions on the Capitol, we would deem it, some individuals, that these are individuals maybe from the Midwest or maybe from the South. And this is not something that people in the North do, because Northerners are progressive. Northerners are enlightened, educational in ways that might be different. But yet, if we look at who participated, even in New Jersey, there were a number of individuals in New Jersey, as reported by news outlets, who were actually participating. And these were actually individuals who were, in some of them, in seats of power. And so we have to be really aware of the who, because the who is a broad spectrum of individuals from various vocational backgrounds, various educational backgrounds, but there were more people in seats of power and individuals in seats of so-called public service that were there that shouldn't have been there, or we wouldn't have presumed at first.
Right. And they showed us quite openly who they were, which is really a remarkable moment. So maybe that hiddenness, all of a sudden there's a light that is being shown on these divisions.
Right.
What was your reaction sort of watching this event unfold? I mean, I was working, and then all of a sudden I was watching the television, and it was just mortifying. I'm just wondering what you felt at that moment.
I remember being in my living room, right? And I had the news on, I was looking, and literally I was paralyzed watching all of this unfold. And I had a range of emotions. One was just complete sadness, and then rage, quite frankly, because, it really shone a light of really what's here. I think, again, back to the whole myth of the exceptionalism, right? Like this is something that we don't do. We're above that. We don't do this to our own government. We are above those things, when in reality, this is here. This is something that I think was a good awakening, and it's really a reckoning, really, for the country to really address it.
Mm-hmm.
And so my perspective, one, I wasn't surprised at all. And so we could feel the tremors in terms of, for the last, we could say 4, but that's actually, the tremors have been going on for a while, in terms of this kind of this intermergence or intersecting between kind of capitalistic inequality, racial overtones, political, I would say, corruption. All of this has been going on for a while under the surface, right? And so that was just a crescendo moment. And it wasn't surprising, because if you look at, other places around the world, you could historically track this and say, this is coming, right? And my quandary, because I really had a quandary, right, is why were there not enough mechanisms collectively from, I would say, from the pilots, from the police, from the people, to try to stop this before this I would say, the moment almost erupted to something that we couldn't put back in the box. Now, being from the South, I wasn't surprised, because these are the ways that the intersections of race and violence and mechanisms to try to maintain power, right? This has always been going on historically. I've seen it in my own life, so it wasn't surprising.
And if I'd like to, if I can piggyback basically off what he said, it also made me think of what I would call rubber bandizing. That's my own little word, rubber bandizing of things that happen when you try to push the bounds too far, right? We give you so much, right? But then when you try to come too far, then we need to pull it back. And I feel that that's what happens over time when certain groups are advancing, then it's like we have to pull it back. And we need to maintain a certain status quo, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, there's if we want to take one positive lesson from this, maybe it's that at least now it's out in the open, right? And we can sort of begin to have that reckoning because it's so overt now in ways that, especially in the Northeast, especially in a place like New Jersey with all its universities and its, that enlightened environment, like quasi-enlightened environment, still that those divisions were hidden for so long, or we could think that they were hidden for so long. So do you have any thoughts about where we go from here in light of what happened? And of course, then there was in the end a peaceful transfer of power. And at the same time, the threat is still there and these divisions are not going away. What are your thoughts about next steps?
That's such a great question. And in terms of the peaceful transfer of power, I think about the poet, right? How she spoke so beautifully and spoke to the better things, the better qualities of who we are and who we can be as a nation. And I think about where we can go is really about policy, right? Platitudes are platitudes, right? But we need change. And really, when we think about who is thy neighbor, when we look at who thy neighbor is, it's about how can they thrive in community if we're not thinking about how they are inadvertently affected by policy, if we are not doing things to help them and raise people up in that way. One policy in particular is the Senate Bill 2656 about police transparency and accountability. I mean, that's tremendous. We are behind 30 other states in this nation that have more police access or more access to police records. So that's something that we can do to help one another. Because again, if there is a group of people who are disproportionately affected by policy, then we can basically hold each other up to make sure that we can make change in the community in which we live.
Right.
So my perspective is a few things. One, it is a reevaluation. It is a reevaluation of I would say the mechanisms in place to make sure that democracy lives, right? So therefore we have to reevaluate, we have to know what they are, we have to introduce that knowledge to the public. So therefore, when democracy begins to hemorrhage, individuals within our nation, we can be aware of this is in place and this is in place. Number two, it also begins with re-education. So what does education look like within a democracy, right? Is what democratic ideals need to be introduced or reintroduced, not only in primary schools, but all the way through business schools, within our law schools. So therefore that our education is connected to some sense of ethic, right? There's an ethic that's connected to democracy, but an ethic will also connected to the other. How do we treat the other? How do we treat other humans, right, within this democracy so that we all can flourish, right? It also begins with, I would say, a reimagination, right? What does our nation look like going forward? King would talk about the beloved community, right? So what is this notion of a beloved community rooted in democracy? What does that look like in the future? What does that look like in terms of policy? What does that look like in terms of law that benefits all of us? What does that look like in terms of putting mechanisms in place so that there is not I would say, another instigation of the neo-fascist moment, which we just went through, this neo-fascist moment that was there in the 1940s, which always seems to reemerge probably every 40 to 60 years, right? Mm-hmm. And then the last thing is this, is I would say, orienting our hearts and our sense of self mm-hmm. to the best traditions within our traditions, whether that's within the democratic tradition, but also within our religious traditions, or even if one espouses or identifies as a humanist, even virtues within the humanist tradition, right? Aristotelian traditions, right? Whether that is traditions with, I would say, I studied in Black church. So whether that's looking at the ideas of Du Bois or even a Frederick Douglass that promote the best in terms of building community, but the best in also working toward having a more just and equitable nation.
Those are really powerful words. I'd like to thank you both, Pastor Antoinette and Pastor Kermit Moss, for being here with us today for Hear Thy Neighbor. And I look forward to speaking with you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us. Have a good evening.
Have a great evening.
One of the key objectives of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition can be called community building. One aspect of this is to increase understanding of and interaction between the Black and Jewish communities through dialogue and programming. The program you're watching right now is part of that. The idea behind Hear Thy Neighbor is to better understand each other by hearing each other's life stories and views. Another aspect of community building is our participation in programs that benefit the broader Middlesex County community. One recent example of this was our donation drive to benefit the Dignity Center in New Brunswick. The Dignity Center, located in the city's Memorial Stadium, allows an opportunity for our most vulnerable population to shower, use bathrooms, and be connected with services and resources. The MBJC's drive, which was held in recognition of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, was very successful thanks to you and all the other generous and caring people in Highland Park and neighboring areas. If you have any questions about the MBJC's activities and/or would like to get involved, please contact us.
Good evening, everyone. This is Sonia Headlam, a member of the Middlesex Black-Jewish Coalition, and I have the great pleasure tonight to speak with Hanina Hanach, who has been a resident of Highland Park since the early 1990s. Hanina, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
I am as well. I know that we have dedicated an episode to the events that occurred at the Capitol, U.S. Capitol on January 6th. But before we get into talking about that, maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and where were you born and raised?
Well, that's a bit complicated. I was born in Chile, but I was raised in Germany. I was 3 years old when my family moved to Germany. My parents are German, but they also were born in different places. So we're an international family that way. And I grew up in various places in Germany. And then when I was 20, I came here to study. I came here on a student visa.
Great. And you've been here ever since, I take it?
And I've been here ever since.
Okay, fantastic. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience of coming to the United States. You came, you said, to study. Do you think at that time you also had in mind that you would become an American?
No, I had no idea. And that was not at all on my mind. I was very excited to come here because I had learned English with Joan Baez, starting when I was 12 years old. Yes. I listened to her songs, and since there was no internet back then to find the texts and I didn't have the songbook yet, I would sit in front of my tape recorder and write down whatever I understood and then look up what the unknown words could be. And then after 2 years, I realized that I could read English novels without any problem.
Wow.
Just from listening to Joan Baez songs and knowing all of them by heart.
Amazing.
And
wow.
And I think at that point I already wanted to at least visit America because that's where Joan Baez lived. But when I actually, yeah.
No, I was going to say, so that played a large role in you wanting to study here.
Yes, and a lot of people in my family also studied in America, in the United States at various points in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. Most of my uncles studied here, and my mother lived here for a while in Chicago and in Indiana, and so America was always part of the family lore, the family stories. and it always felt close.
I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about some of your first impressions about America and yeah, just kind of what you thought of it when you arrived.
See, I came here to study. So I lived at a university, in the university setting. Most of the professors and all the students lived on campus. So it was a very homogeneous society that way. It's for all scholars. They came from all over the world, but it were all people who were there to study. And that was my whole life for about 10 years. First in college, and then when I came back for graduate school. And when I started teaching at the university as well, they let me teach it as part of my graduate studies. So it was a very narrow view of America. I got glimpses of the surroundings because we lived on the south side was on the south side of Chicago, and the university had the largest private police force in the country, and that sort of put us on notice about how we could move there. So I cannot say that I got to know America in those first 10 years because I just saw a very small segment of it. And was only later when we moved here, after I got married, 2 years, we moved here to Highland Park, that I got to see more of America and the regular life that people outside of the universities lead.
Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about January 6th and what you, I know that I watched the events unfold live on the news that day. I was kind of like riveted in front of my TV. Maybe you could talk about your experience of taking the news in and just some of your reactions, your gut reactions to what you were seeing.
It was horrifying, but it was not unexpected. Whatever I had been reading in online and the speeches I heard were a pretty clear preparation of what was going to come. So I was not surprised, but the pictures of the windows being smashed, I only saw the attacks on policemen later. And the Southern flag there, the Confederate flag being carried through the Capitol, those were shocking images. And just the destruction that they wrought there. As I said, I was not surprised. It was still horrifying that it could actually happen this way. And then there was a good deal of anger mixed in because we had been watching the demonstrations, the BLM demonstrations through the summer very closely. And the violence, the quasi-military violence against peaceful demonstrators all through the summer, the vilification of them, and the way they were dragged off and beaten up. And there you have hundreds of terrorists attacking the center of our government, and they hardly did anything. They tried to push them away a little bit, but we didn't see anyone arrested or stopped. And I even saw some policemen doing their selfies with those thugs, and that was really horrifying. Where is the justice there? Because they were white, they were violent. Whereas with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations during the summer, I had the feeling that a lot of the violence came from people who were trying to cook their own little soup on that fire. Because I've experienced that in demonstrations in Germany that were peaceful until the police got involved. And then people who wanted violence joined the peaceful demonstrations so that they could do their own little thing there, and I had a feeling that that was going on a lot during the summer.
Why is it, do you think, that you could see this coming when so many Americans say that they can't? Like, oh, I was shocked, or I can't believe that happened. What is it about you or your background or your...
I grew up in a very political home. My mother talked about politics all the time. My father tried to dial that down a little bit because he saw that there was more to life. But my mother grew up thinking politically, and she was very engaged politically, not necessarily party politics, even though she was a founding member of the Northern German Greens in the late 70s. But just involved with community and helping people and demonstrating for peace and against nuclear reactors. And so politics was very much a part of my life, and the discussions going on and the guests from all over the world that we had at home all the time. We grew up in my mother spoke six languages. My father spoke 3. There were always people coming through and talking about the things that they experienced in their countries, and we had exchange visits with France, and so that was very much part of my upbringing.
Right. So you had
always have the conversations about that.
Right.
And my mother was my mother was always fighting for the underdogs wherever she came across them. When she was in her late 80s, she felt that the Turks were treated too badly in Germany still. And so she started taking Turkish lessons, even though Turkish is impossible to learn for anyone who doesn't grow up with it, so that she would at least be able to say hello and thank you and smile in Turkish when she met someone from Turkey.
Wow.
But that's, with that kind of attitude, you become aware of, start to listen for what's going on.
Right.
Wow, my mother grew up in Nazi Germany, and so she talked about that all the time. She told us about that, told us about what happened back then. And as horrible as that is to say, it did prepare me for the last 4 years. People were unaware of one of the things. People were unaware of what was coming, even though it was very clearly said beforehand. We knew what Trump was going to do. It was very clear. He did not try to hide it. But people did not listen. They did not want to believe it. And people did not want to believe that Hitler was going to do the things that he said he was going to do. My mother firmly believed that he was going to do it. Nobody knew how horrible it was going to be, just because that was basically unimaginable. But Americans don't think in those terms. Americans, by and large, are very apolitical. They don't think in political terms, very few. Because they grow up in this firm belief that America is the greatest democracy and everything is just okay as long as we keep it that way. And they don't see as easily as someone who has grown up with the history of what can happen, and who sees it from outside.
Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that you weren't surprised to see it happen, maybe you could talk about how it changed your perspective of America, if it did at all, and in what ways.
It did not change my perspective of America. That change had become much more radicalized inside me the last 4 years. It was not that insurrection at the Capitol. And it was not foreseeable that it would happen at the Capitol in this way. I just had a feeling that with the kinds of demonstrators who were going to come, that there was going to be violence.
So what about...
But it did not change my view of America, because my view of America had plenty of time the last 4 years to show to what depths we can sink when there is not enough power to hold against it.
Right.
That was a big wake up.
Yes, absolutely. So what are your feelings about the future of America, and where the country goes from here?
I am hopeful because of what I saw this summer. And of course, I'm hopeful because of the way that the new government has made a start making sure that they start more equitably for everyone. The fact that there were voices being raised and people coming together during those demonstrations in the summer, and to raise awareness of how so many people in this country have to live with that constant fear. I read a lot of children's books, and I think that is important in this context to read about how in Black families, parents have to prepare their children for how to act when the police stops them. It's something that I had never had to think about in my life. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that I never thought about what it would look like for people who are living with society's prejudices this way. And so reading those stories taught me differently. But I think there's a lot more talk about this now because of the demonstrations in the summer and because of what happened now, which has probably opened the eyes of more people of what the consequences are of this hatred gone wild that we've experienced for the last 4 years.
Right.
So I think there is chance for a change.
Yep.
But it will take a lot of work and not giving up on it and not becoming complacent again.
Yes, I think that's such an important point. It sounds like equity, justice, some of these huge concepts that we as Americans believe that our country stands for. In theory. But
yes. They're beautiful on paper. They're beautiful on paper. But even on paper, they were not fully there.
Exactly.
I mean, when you look at the beginnings of this country, when more than half the population could not vote, either because they were women or because they were slaves,
right.
or immigrants who were not counted.
Right. Exactly.
I've been a teacher for the last 18 years. I've been teaching at a high school nearby, and that has taught me a lot more about America, certainly than being at the university in Chicago, because I could see there how some of the kids struggle and what their thoughts are and the way they think and the way they learn or have difficulties learning. That has taught me a lot, and has also taught me a lot about how much I have to learn about conflicts that exist here that were just not on my radar this way before. I met with a lot of aggression from African American students, and at first I did not quite understand because I was trying to work with everyone. And it was through conversations with colleagues, with my husband, who was very aware of the problems, and with the kids, that I realized at what base they start out on, and that they are, how many of them are constantly ready to defend themselves, even when it's not necessary. That as a teacher, it was my task to learn to meet that before it became a crisis. And I don't know how good I got at it, but I became aware of it at least, and I tried.
I think that is what it is going to take. Being willing to have those conversations, being willing to have things that you're not aware of, that you know, your eyes are open to them. And that goes, both ways, I think. The work doesn't end.
No.
There is no end. There is no, oh, well, I've done this and now I move on. And it's a constant, once you are committed to seeing and responding to an unjust or inequities that exist. That
and
work
even just
is
feelings that exist.
Yeah.
I don't know how much the inequities, I mean, of course they exist at the school too, just because there's no way around that. But the feelings, they don't go away.
Right.
Because those kids are carrying around with them a whole long history. And how come on just put that away?
So, Hanina, thank you so much again for being with us tonight. It's been a pleasure getting to learn more about your life and your reactions to what occurred on January 6th. I'm a resident of Highland Park also, so I do hope that
really?
I am. So I do hope
there will be opportunities for meeting. That's
exactly right. That would be wonderful. And I know we are all thankful for your time tonight. And I think that it's really important that we have these conversations and have this opportunity to share reflections with our community. So thank you. It really means a lot to all of us at MBJC. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad to have met you.
Same. Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Hear Thy Neighbor. We hope you found it informative and are very thankful you joined us. If you have any comments, we'd love to hear from you. If you know anyone whose stories you think would be interesting to share in future programs, we'd like to hear from you about that too. To contact us with your comments, or if you'd simply like more information about the coalition, please email us at info@mbjc-nj.org. You can also check our Facebook page. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.